not all methods are the same. Python sometimes makes a distinction depending on the method name. Here's an example of one of those methods. That's the Dunder init method. The Dunder init method gets called for you when you create a new object. The new blank object is passed to self, and the name is whatever you put inside your constructor's arguments. And then we've sort of defined a new property inside self, and we've given the value of our parameter. So the Dunder init method is a special method because Python calls it for you automatically. When you create an object, you don't have to call it yourself. So here's a couple other interesting special methods. First of all, let's define a list of movies. What do you think is going to happen when I print out the movies class? Now, we looked at printing the student class earlier, and you got some sort of student thing printed out. What is the movies class? Is it an error? Well, as you can see, we get a class list. So that's some pretty bizarre functionality there. Does this mean that a list is somehow an object? Yes. Pretty much everything in Python is an object, and this list is no different. Only we've not had to create it using this constructor like student type thing. Instead, Python's created it for us automatically when we use this syntax. You can, however, print, for example, hi.class, and that's going to give you a string class. See, str. So everything is an object in Python. What does it mean for a list to be an object? Well, it means that everything we can do with a list, we can do with our own classes. So here's an example. We can print out the length of movies. Okay, now we know that movies is an object. So what is going on behind the scenes that is allowing us to call this len function, give it the movies object, and it's given us 2? Well, let's do it. Let's create a class garage. And in it, we're going to define an init method that is going to define self.cars to be an empty list. Now, we can create our garage. Let's say Ford is going to be a garage. And now this Ford has a Ford.cars has this cars property here that is going to print out an empty list when we print it out, because that's what we've assigned it to. However, we can say Ford.cars.append Fiesta and Ford.cars.append Focus, for example. Then when we run this program again, now we get a list of 2 items, Fiesta and Focus. Now, what if I wanted to do len of Ford? Ford is the garage. Remember, I want to get the length of Ford because that's going to tell me how many cars there are inside my garage. Of course, when we run this, we get a type error. Object of type garage has no len. Okay, that's an interesting error. It tells us that Python cannot calculate the length of this garage because it doesn't know what the length of the garage is meant to be, or is meant to mean even. So in order to tell Python that this garage has a length, we have to define another dunder method. And that's __len__. Again, it takes in self, like all methods do, and then it has to return the length of the garage. In this case, how many cars there are. So it's going to return the length of self.cars. Now, when we run this program again, we'll see that 2 gets printed out, even though we've called len of Ford, our garage object, instead of len of Ford.cars. That's because when we call len, Ford comes over to here, self, and then we return the length of self.cars. The list also has this dunder len method that gives us the number of items in the list. That's a slightly more complicated definition, but nonetheless, what we have to know is that this len dunder method allows us to do something and return a value that will get returned to us when we call the len function on our object. Let's do something like, for example, Ford 0. Ford 0 should give us the first car in the queue of cars that we're working with, for example. In this case, it should be Fiesta because that's the first card we appended. Of course, if we run this, we'll get that garage object does not support indexing. Remember, this is accessing something by an index. Python calls it indexing. What to do? Well, you guessed it. We'll define another dunder method. Here's a challenge for you. Pause the video and go and find out how you can index your own custom object. It's going to be a bit of a challenge, a bit tricky, but I'm sure you can do it. Okay, I'm sure you got that. We have to define a new dunder method, and this time it's called getItem. And it takes self, of course, the object that we're calling this on, and it also takes the index that we're trying to access, I. So remember, this is just another way of calling Ford.getItem with Ford, garage.getItem with Ford and 0. Okay, this is syntactic sugar for this. What we're doing is calling the getItem function of the garage class, and we're passing to it the Ford object that we've created and the index that we want to access, which is 0. And all we have to do is return self.cars.i. Self.cars I. And that's going to give us the ith index of the self.cars list. Let's run it. And there you have it. We get Fiesta back. So these are two pretty important dunder methods that can be quite useful in many circumstances. Whenever you want an object that will store things and that you can access, these two methods can be pretty useful. Now, as soon as you've implemented the len and getItem methods, some new functionality gets unlocked, and that is that you can iterate over your garage. You can use a for loop on your garage, but only when you have these two methods defined, okay? Because Python is going to use these two methods in the background of the for loop in order to iterate over it. And there you have it. You get Fiesta and Focus. So that's some pretty cool stuff. When the first time I learned about this, I was, pardon the expression, flabbergasted, because I really didn't know much about these dunder methods, and it's pretty interesting because everything you can do in Python, all the built-in functions like len and sum, and all the constructs like for, are all built on objects having these special methods. So learning about these is really exciting, and we're going to learn about them as we go along the course. But I wanted to give you another two special methods, in fact, that are the dunder wrapper and dunder string. So let's implement dunder wrapper. This is how you define the wrapper. And this wrapper should be used to print out a string representing the object. So let's once again put self in here, and we can return. This should be, I said it should be used to print out a string. That's a lie. It should be used to return a string that represents the object. So we can define this as being a garage, and inside of it, we're going to put self.cars. That really represents our garage. It's a garage object, and it has this list of cars inside of it. The dunder string, str, should be used to return a string that tells the user some information about this garage, such that if you were to print the object out, the user might gain some useful insights about the garage you're printing out. So in this case, we should return something like f, garage with len of self cars. Notice how the wrapper, the dunder wrapper, returns a sort of codified version of this garage. It includes everything we need in order to represent this object. And the str method returns something that a user might want to read. That's really the difference between these two. Okay. Notice how here we've accessed len of self. I love this. Self is the object, so when you call len of self, you're really calling the len method that you defined up here. Now, when you print Ford down here, you'll see the str gets used. Garage with 2 cars. So when does the Dunder repr method get used? The Dunder repr method gets used particularly when you are coding. When you're using a debugger, we're going to learn what that is in a few sections' time. It can be really useful for you to look at the object and understand exactly what it is made up of, in this case cars. As we look into debugging, we're going to look more at the repr function and why it can be useful. So don't worry too much about it for now. Just know that the str function can be really useful when printing things out to a user. However, if you are only going to implement one of these two, choose the repr. You can just delete the repr. You can turn this str into a repr and delete this repr here and make it print something a user will want to see. And this is a better approach. When you now print Ford, it's going to call the repr function instead of the str function, because repr is sort of a bit more important. So if you're only going to implement one, implement the repr. But of course, if you can implement both, one for a more code-oriented description and the other one for a more user-oriented description, this is much better. I am a strong proponent that every class you create should have a repr and an str function, methods, sorry. Okay. There's many more magic Dunder methods you can implement, including some to add objects together. After all, integers are also objects. You can overload what Boolean operators do. You can make your objects callable. You can do things like add context managers. We're going to look at what those are, and much, much more. We'll be learning about a lot of these Dunder methods throughout the course, because this, again, is the most comprehensive Python course that you can take. So I want to cover everything about Python. That's it for this video. I know it's getting a bit more advanced, so hopefully you're still with me. When we get to building our next project, everything's going to be a bit clear.